We're going to be looking at this HIV epidemic in Central and Eastern European countries through a different perspective. So here are my disclosures. When we talk about Central and Eastern Europe, we're actually talking about two things at once. We're talking about two epidemics with two different main types of transmissions, two epidemiological patterns. But what's important to keep in mind is that we're also talking about one thing. We're talking about one HIV infection, and we're talking about one pool of patients who all need access to the best standard of care. So I'll focus the first part of my presentation on the differences between countries in Central and Eastern European, and then I'll conclude on where are the common grounds. So when we're looking at the surveillance data from the ECDC, we have this very nice colored maps where we can definitely see how new HIV diagnoses are acquired in Eastern countries, mainly through heterosexual transmission or through injecting drug use, whereas in Central Europe, new HIV diagnoses mostly come in men who have sex with men. And here we have a list of different countries who have different transmission routes, injecting drug use, heterosexual contact, and transmission in groups of MSMs. Also, if we look in Eastern Europe, we can see that there is a higher percentage of adults who are diagnosed late, so who are late presenters, being diagnosed at a CD4 cell count below 350 cells. And we know that the male-to-female ratio is not balanced between countries in the East and in Central Europe, with more male patients in the center and more female patients in the East. And here we can see a breakdown by country and the European region in terms of the male-to-female ratio in new HIV diagnosis. But again, what's important to keep in mind is that when looking at these first slides, I've only been talking about new diagnosis. And it's really important to remember that each country has its own specific history, its own history of HIV infection, and its already existing pool of patients. And when we're looking at this nice map from an article that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, we see a lot of blue on the map. So we see a lot of B subtypes in most of Europe. We also see some A subtypes in the south, in Greece and Albania. And I'm just going to stop and talk to you about two countries. The first country I'm going to talk about is Romania, which is painted almost completely in red on this map. Because infection occurred with the subtype F1. It is the famous story of the pediatric cohort, pediatric HIV cohort. In the late 80s, early 90s, there was parenteral transmission of HIV in children who came from HIV-negative patients, so from healthy families. Right now, in Romania, people living with HIV, almost 90% of them are under antiretroviral treatment. And this pediatric cohort is no longer pediatric, as most of them are adults. They are approaching the age of 30 years old, and they're starting their own families. They're having their own kids. So this is where it's really important to talk about prevention of mother-to-child transmission. And there's been this recent paper that talked about the methods that we're applying in Romania in terms of screening during pregnancy, screening at least once, ideally twice, at the beginning and in the end of pregnancy, treating all female patients with combined antiretroviral therapy, elective C-section, ablactation, and prophylaxis in the newborn. And with all these combined measures, the rate of transmission has been below 2.5%. And the second country that I'm going to talk about has a somewhat different but somewhat also similar story. It is Ukraine. It's the country where we saw most of the new HIV diagnoses in women during the past few years. And of course, we have a wealth of data regarding pregnancy outcomes and regarding mother-to-child transmission as well in this country. So this real interesting article from the Lancet HIV shows the trends, what has been happening from 2000 up to 2012. And what they showed is that HIV diagnosis is established earlier in HIV infection, and treatment is started also earlier during pregnancy. So if at the beginning of the year 2000, pregnant females were starting antiretroviral treatment at a median gestational age of 34 weeks, this age decreased to 28 weeks and to 24 weeks by 2012, and it has definitely decreased since. Also, the proportion of women who received antiretroviral treatment increased from 22% to 52% to 48% and to 91%. And the reported transmission, mother-to-child transmission, is somewhere between 2 and 4%. And of course, this rate is expected to be even lower since things have continued to change following 2012 and following the publication of this article. And diagnosis of HIV infection now occurs earlier during pregnancy, and treatment is also started earlier. So since we're talking about pregnancy and we're talking about women, let's just have a quick look at some barriers to access to care reported in the EEA study, Women Living with HIV Across 27 Countries. And we're going to specifically look at women from Central and Eastern Europe, who in the study had a mean age of 32.2 years old. It's important to see that almost half of them were living in serodiscordant couples, so their partners were HIV negative. And what's really interesting is that 90%, so most of them, said that they would not disclose, or they would only choose to disclose their HIV status in case of intimate relations or to people they were really close to, which really points to how big stigma still is and how it is perceived. In terms of formal education, 2/3 of the patients had less than 12 years of education, and this somehow was reflected in the fact that only half of them were currently employed. So they had to choose between 12 potential barriers, and in Central and Eastern Europe, similar to most of the world, they chose 6 of these barriers as applying to their own history. And let's have a quick look at these barriers. On these maps, where we see green, it means no problem at all, and where we have darker colors, we're talking about major problems. So for the first barriers, most of the women responded that they have no problem at all in terms of the distance to the medical facility, in terms of healthcare personnel providing access to patients with HIV, in terms of having access to trained and competent healthcare practitioners, and transport to the healthcare facility. Again, mental health appears to be available, and psychological support as well. However, when we start talking about knowledge of HIV and about HIV in the community, and when we start talking about stigma in the community, we see a lot of purple. So we see that most of the respondents considered that these were problems, either somewhat of a problem or major problems. And this is really worrisome since we have strong data showing us exactly how HIV is transmitted. And since we all know that, we would expect the community to also know that. And it points to the fact that we might need some more outreach programs. Again, in terms of employment opportunities, there are some problems, and also regarding the supportive work environments, which obviously translates into issues in terms of financial resources and affordable housing. And if we were to break down by country, we can see that stigma is reported by virtually all of the countries, which leads to skipping medical appointments because of the fear of meeting someone that they know and thereby disclosing their HIV status. Some of the countries are reporting educational barriers, some report social support barriers, and this heat map really shows which countries have which kind of needs right now. And one thing that I would like to point out is the fact that some of the countries reported that they need better access to family planning, specifically for the HIV-positive population. So this interesting article published in the International Journal of Infectious Diseases asks the question, how close are we to the 90-90-90 UNAIDS target? And I'm going to start with their conclusion. Their conclusion was that there are major disparities in the provision of HIV care among subregions in Europe, which should be addressed. And let's have a look at the data and see how they came to this conclusion. So they surveyed 24 countries, and all of the surveyed countries responded that they have implemented mandatory screening for HIV in blood and organ donors. However, when looking at other specific risk groups, we see that the rate is lower, and it is a bit above 50% for people who inject drugs, men who have sex with men, sex workers, and pregnant women. Initiation of antiretroviral treatment, only 40% of the countries initiate immediately after diagnosis, and almost 1/3 of the countries still wait for the CD4 cell count to drop below 500 and even below 350 cells. And we see a list of all the countries who are currently facing late presenters or patients who present for diagnosis when they already have advanced disease. And we see that there's different patterns for different countries. And when looking at the continuum of care, what we would like to see here, where we would like to see 90% of those with HIV infection actually being diagnosed. And we see that the percentages are quite different between different countries. And then we have the percentages of patients who are receiving antiretroviral therapy and are undetectable. And we have to keep in mind that the targets are 90, 90, 90. But even though this article was published this month, so in 2018, this continuum of care was from 2014. So let's look at how things have changed up until the most recent continuum of care published for the year 2016. Well, the targets, we are closer to the target, and we need to remember that although this is an ambitious target, it is a very effective way of curbing the HIV epidemic if we manage to reach it. So in terms of co-infections, looking at co-infection with hepatitis virus, this article reports co-infection with HPV, a mean percentage of 10%, with a range anywhere from 0 to 30% in different countries, whereas the percentage of HCV infection, HCV co-infection is at 23.4%. However, these numbers may be a bit underestimated, since we know that there is data showing that in Central Europe, co-infection, or at least seroprevalence for anti-HCV antibodies, is reported at 34% in Central Europe and 57.7% in Eastern Europe. So where do these disparities in HIV care come from? And this study has looked at East Europe compared to everything that is non-Eastern Europe. So what they showed was that in Eastern Europe, there's a higher percentage of countries that currently defer treatment. They wait until the CD4 cell count drops below 350 copies, and there is lower access to resistant testing, both at baseline and even at the time of failure. So the common grounds are that both HPV screening and HCV screening tend to be similar in Eastern Europe and in non-Eastern Europe. However, when looking at HPV vaccination, we see that there is a dramatically lower coverage in Eastern Europe, and the same is true for access to direct-acting antivirals for patients who are also diagnosed with HCV infection. Another major issue is co-infection with TB, and we see that in terms of TB screening, Eastern Europe and non-Eastern Europe seem to be performing similarly. However, the test used in Eastern Europe is still the tuberculin skin test, whereas Central Europe has moved towards the interferon gamma release assay. However, the major issue, and where there also is a statistically significant difference, is in terms of TB care, which is not integrated into HIV care in Eastern Europe and has to be offered through referral to a different specialist, to a different clinic altogether. And it definitely makes things more complicated for both healthcare practitioner and patient. So in terms of screening, Eastern Europe, non-Eastern Europe seem to do the same types of screening in terms of hematology, liver function, renal function, pap smears, anorectal exams, OBGYN exams. However, Eastern Europe seems to focus less on cardiovascular disease screening and seems to ask less questions in terms of, are you smoking, are you drinking alcohol, or are you using drugs? Treatment services for drug and alcohol abuse seem to be available and all over Europe. However, again, we see a significant difference in terms of family planning. And family planning services specifically for HIV appear to be an unmet need in Eastern Europe. In terms of guidelines, we saw that Central Europe is mostly using the EX guidelines, whereas Eastern Europe tend to have more of personalized guidelines, national guidelines. And here I'm going to stop for just 1 second and look at vaccination. There's really no strong data in terms of vaccination coverage in HIV patients, specifically from different countries in Europe, comparing Central Europe to Eastern Europe. But where we stand, we know that we're somewhere maybe around 10% in terms of influenza vaccination coverage and pneumococcal vaccination coverage, 4.9% for HPV vaccination, although this rate might be higher in specific risk groups. And HPV vaccination coverage is reported to be at 84%, but I'd like to urge caution regarding this percentage since it's data derived from the US and the rates of vaccination in Europe might be somewhat lower. And we actually don't know where we stand in terms of hepatitis A vaccination, although we do know that MSMs who are also HIV infected have a twofold higher seroprevalence of IgGs for both Hep A and for both Hep E. So this is maybe where some vaccination rollout programs could be extremely useful. So before finishing this talk, let's also look at the common grounds. What do Eastern Europe and Central Europe have in common when we're talking about HIV infection? So the common grounds, U equals U. So if you're undetectable, infection is untransmissible. Common grounds, again, PrEP, and you're going to hear a lot more about PrEP in the following sessions today. However, the question on everybody's lips, for fans of the movie Groundhog's Day, the question on everybody's lips is how do we translate these two very important concepts into our day-to-day clinical practice? How does this translate into patients who are also engaging in chemsex? How does PrEP work in people who chose to take it only 4 out of 7 days, so Tuesday, Thursday, Saturdays, and Sundays? And how do both U equals U and PrEP apply to patients who also have concomitant sexually transmitted infection? So I think that what you're gonna see in the following presentations and the following sessions today is exactly how can we translate this and how can this information be meaningful to our day-to-day clinical practice. And I'm gonna sum up by just listing 3 common interventions that are pretty straightforward. So scaling up of HIV testing in pregnancy, stressing on earlier testing and repeated testing as well, access to testing and linkage to care of risk groups. And we've talked about MSMs, we've talked about injecting drug users, we've talked about MSMs, and linkage to care is really important in all the risk groups and in all patients with HIV infection. And we also need to remember that vaccination is essential, and we should really focus more on seeing how each healthcare system performs in terms of vaccine coverage. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention.